Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for clicking play and welcome back. We sure do appreciate your support. We have on the line our daily contributor, Rory from SGT Report. How are you, man?
I'm doing quite well. Thanks for having me.
Well, thanks for hopping on. We've got Eric Dubin, who does the heavy lifting over at News Doctors on the line. Eric, how are you?
Wonderful. Thanks for calling Doc and I.
Yeah, and happy to have you guys on. Doc, how are you doing?
I'm doing well. Thanks, guys. Great to be back.
Yeah, it's so good to have a roundtable with you guys because we wanted to start with the boots on the ground update on the precious metals market. I don't think there's many people out there that can speak better to it than you, Doc, and Eric. So Rory's got a couple of questions. Rory, why don't you take it away?
All right. Doc, I wanted to find out what's going on with the premiums. Are they stabilizing, which is what it seems like, as far as the 90% silver coin? How's the availability? And what are you seeing as far as your business? I'm just curious if you're seeing an upswing in new customers, if there's any large orders that are coming in, that kind of thing. Just kind of a general update on what's happening with silver and gold.
Sure, Rory. I'd be glad to give you kind of an update. As far as new customers, we're definitely seeing a big upswing in new customers. Just looking at the numbers here, in the past 10 days, looks like about 1,500 new customers.
Wow.
But really a lot of that is more than the market, is kind of related just with SD Bullion and the Silver Eagles sale we've been running of 225 over spot on those, and we've been spending a bit advertising throughout Google and trying to hit markets that haven't heard of us before. So I don't really think that's quite indicative of the entire market. What we've been hearing, talking to all the authorized dealers and the suppliers, overall the market's down a little bit from what it was, certainly say second half of last October and November. And premiums, as you mentioned, premiums are low right now. They're really comparable. A lot of the products that are comparable to some of the lowest premiums there's been in the past 15 years. The 90% is not quite what it was, let's say 2-3 years ago, when it was, for a while, it was almost down around spot. It's still retail running probably $1.50 to $2.50 over spot. But there is a decent amount of supply on the market right now, so nothing screaming major imminent shortage of physical silver. But again, that can change quickly with a big move to the upside or the downside. And I personally think it's a bit indicative of silver is now a couple dollars off its recent lows. And until we see either renewed lows or else another week or two of sustained rallying, that's when you'll likely see big demand come back. But at the same time, overall, silver demand is still extremely strong. Historically speaking, I mean, the Mint's already sold over 12 million ounces of Silver Eagles in the first quarter, so maybe a bit off of last year's pace, but still historically just about dang near all-time highs.
I've got a follow-up question for you, Doc. With you guys running your special there, 225 over spot for Silver Eagles, any quantity. There's a banner actually at the top of SGT Report. We appreciate SD Bullion's support. But my question is with the cost of silver below production, and that is quantifiable, we're hearing it from many different mining companies, with the cost of silver below production, I'm going to ask the question that Rory asks so often because I'm really starting to get puzzled. Where is all of this silver coming from? Is demand just so low worldwide that there's never going to be a shortage? Because if you do the quantifiable numbers on this thing, it makes no sense with 700 million ounces, mined a year, or whatever, 600 to 800 million mined a year. Where is all the silver coming from to meet this physical demand?
Well, you do have to remember that the law was changed a couple of years ago. I don't know if any of you guys can remember the exact date or year. I can't off the top of my head. It used to be that by law the Silver Eagle supply had to be sourced domestically, and that was changed a couple of years back. So silver has been imported to meet that demand over the last few years.
Well, it's just stunning. A little anecdotal story for you guys. I've got a carpenter friend who I've known for 25 years, and he and I were together working on a project recently, and he was just asking me a few questions here and there, just about life. We're catching up, and I told him about silver, and he just thought that was the funniest thing. He actually laughed out loud to hear that I had been buying silver over the years. People think it's amusing. People think that we're quaint and odd and funny to be investors in precious metals. That's how far removed most of the people are in this society. But that's not true if you look worldwide, is it, you guys? I mean, Eric, if you look worldwide, we see nation states and people living in other nation states acquiring precious metals as part of their DNA. It's part of their culture, but we don't see that here in the States.
That's very true, and we're seeing just unbelievable demand in Asia. At this point, it looks like China could easily take down as much gold as they ever have in any given year of her entire history this year. I mean, the offtake on the Shanghai Gold Exchange is just phenomenal. It's already running above last year's month-over-month comparisons. And India probably scarfed down about 100 metric tons of gold in the last month. The reporting on Chinese gold demand is basically sourced from the World Gold Council, and their numbers are just probably half as much as what China ultimately consumes, and the World Gold Council's numbers end up feeding through Reuters and GFMS the entire Wall Street, London, Western financial establishment's point of view about what gold is in terms of supply and demand. So, we have this kind of like alternative reality where the entire mainstream is trying to deny the manipulation, and then simultaneous to that, the what I call conventional establishment, Wall Street type thinking, percentage of the overall financial establishment being, well known for 90% of the individual actors in our financial world having absolutely no clue what actual supply and demand numbers really are. It's almost comical.
Yeah, and I was reading an article at KWN, an interview with Pierre Lassonde, and he was describing the mania phase in gold and silver, gold specifically, but gold and silver, which is yet to come. He said it's going to take off in 2016, and it will not be driven by Europe. It will not be driven by the United States, so that means it won't be driven by the LBMA or the COMEX. He said specifically it will be driven by Asia, by the SGE, which you just mentioned. Can you help quantify that? Where are we with the SGE? And maybe more importantly now, maybe we could bridge over and talk about the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the AIIB. But first of all, though, do you think Pierre Lassonde is right about the SGE? Is that where we're going to finally see fair prices and mania take hold?
It'll help set the price mechanism. Markets are supposedly price discovery mechanisms, and that's farcical when you think about all the paper jockeying vis-a-vis the underlying physical commodities. Just to back up a step, commodities markets are like a 400, 300-year invention, and the predominant ways in which farmers initially were able to deal with the vagaries of weather and whatnot were to form partnerships with speculators, and speculators are a good thing in this regard because it allowed for a more freely flowing overall economic system with a capitalist system that helped the movement of real goods and services, and that's the key. And the difference between those markets of yesteryear with the Frankenstein creations that we have now, where paper is so overwhelmingly dominating the price discovery mechanism such that it actually breaks the mechanism. And what China ultimately would love to see happen is that in the long run they want to have the yuan, or the renminbi, better stated for international purposes, the reserve currency of the world. And they have a trajectory that they envision to see something like this happen. Gold is a part of this overall evolution because even though in the West central bankers consider gold to be a barbarous relic, it's very well understood, even amongst the very same central bankers in the West, that from a psychological point of view, having a whole heck of a lot of gold helps support your currency. And so China has been doing this multi-year plan of trying to beef up its gold holdings. They established the Shanghai Gold Exchange to help facilitate their own accumulation, but also ultimately the physical necessity of having gold to be able to be delivered when you're making transactions on that exchange is a critical difference between the COMEX for sure, and the LBMA supposedly was more of a more of a physical trading. exchange, but it has slowly been captured by the paper jockeys as well too. So I don't know. That's a long roundabout way of addressing the background to your question, but the bottom line is that China's overall accumulation of gold is pursuant to their longer-term objectives of beefing up their economy and eventually becoming the owner of the reserve currency of the world.
Well, now I'm sorry, I got to ask another follow-up question. Rory, jump in at any point here, but I think this is just so massively important to just flush out further. First of all, Adrian Douglas, before his passing, he had done such terrific work quantifying the 50-to-1 leverage at the LBMA, and that was 3-4 years ago when I was reporting on his work. I wonder what the leverage is, paper to physical, at the LBMA now. But circling back to the yuan as the future world's reserve currency, we see Operation Jade Helm, the U.S. military rolling out Operation Jade Helm this summer, a 2-month exercise. They're labeling a couple of the states, Texas, Utah, and part of California, as hostile territory. You know, one wonders if it isn't just all in prep for a worst-case scenario where the dollar is devalued overnight or where the dollar starts to crash in earnest, as the nation-states are clearly moving away from the dollar as a reserve currency. In your mind, Eric, quantify for us, if you can, I know it's a guess, but what would it mean to the dollar? What would it mean to the average citizen in the United States if what you're describing with the yuan happens in the next 5-10 years, less, maybe more? But if that happens in the next 5-10 years, what does that mean to those of us living in this country where the dollar is king?
We derive a lot of benefits from having the reserve currency status that the United States controls. I mean, basically, the Treasury can conjure up debt, and then it is basically created out of thin air, and our economy grows as a result when this gets pushed out into our economic system, and then we can procure goods and services from other countries around the world as our credit system expands with this fictitious credit expansion. So the ability to live at a higher standard of living based on borrowed funds, because the banking system is a private banking system, and this credit-based fiat system that we have creates currency out of thin air based on the ability for the Fed to be and the Treasury to assess tax revenues going forward years into the future. We're basically borrowing from our future generations the ability to consume today, and instead of borrowing from ourselves, we're borrowing from bankers. So we will be taxed in the future to pay off the debt that we are creating now out of thin air that's procurement to the bankers that are helping us to create the currency out of thin air, the fiat that we're creating. It's a really twisted system that has been foisted upon us by the banking interests, the oligarchy, and as a result, you get that direct translation of the lower standard of living simply because every single American will be taxed based on their income if they're in an informal economy. So their standard of living will decline because they're going to be paying off for the consumption that we're consuming today. That's one aspect. And then the other aspect is that as the dollar will decline in relative purchasing power versus other currencies, everything that we would import will cost more. So it's a double whammy that basically dilutes the living standards of Americans in the future. And then, you can even layer on a third aspect to this in that there's so much, there's like probably $9 to $11 trillion worth of U.S.-based credit floating around in the international markets. And part of the reason why it remains parked is because people consider it to have a store of value function, and that even though the dollar's perception of value is declining now, it still has a perceived value. When we go down the slippery slope of losing that perceived value, more of that store of value that's in the central bank holders and so forth, in sovereign wealth funds, will be liberated, and they'll come out into the market and they'll all flow home, because if there's more commerce worldwide being conducted in the yuan or other national currencies, and the dollar trade status is in decline in addition to the reserve status, there's only so much you can do with your dollars, and eventually more of that dollar flow will flow back to the United States, and that'll create domestic inflation. That's kind of like the thesis that John John Williams over at Shadow Stats talks about as
Right.
far as his mechanics for what would set off a hyperinflation.
Right. Did you guys see the snippet from Janet Yellen recently in which she basically said the dollar is not a store of value? Did you guys see?
Yeah, you're kidding.
No,
I mean,
she
that's
did. It was really a marbles in the mouth moment, but she basically said just that, and that was posted over at Zero Hedge. I'll put it in this video so you guys can at least see what I was talking about.
Was that posted today?
No, this goes back about a week.
Okay.
And we're having this conversation here, guys, on Thursday, the 2nd of April, so this is not an April Fool's joke. That was Janet Yellen actually said that. Basically what you're describing, Eric, is the end of life as we know it. The end of economic life in this country as we know it, surely.
Yeah, with one caveat. I mean, it can happen over a protracted period of time, like in a couple of years. Other than that John Williams scenario where everyone just around the world freaks out because of perhaps a catalyst like the financial market shock to make people suddenly say, hey, wait a minute, the dollar's reserve status is not what it's meant out to be, and therefore I don't want as many as I have.
Yeah, well, or in a coordinated effort. What if all of those nation states decided to get together and just dump the dollar in a coordinated effort to take this country down? It's not beyond the realm of possibility. And, against the backdrop of all this, you guys, against the backdrop of all this, we have my friend, a good friend, a smart man with a family, he's a great guy, laughing and finding it very quaint and humorous that those of us out there who are in the know would be interested in investing in physical silver and then gold, of course. It's humorous to some. And at the end of the day, the joke's going to be on those folks because they are going to be woefully unprepared for the end of economic life as we know it. Doc and Rory, I rest my case.
Well, I wanted to say that with the Chinese in particular, they've been encouraging their citizenship to acquire gold as well. So that plays into what you were saying a minute ago, Eric, as far as the yuan being backed by gold at some point, or the renminbi. And Doc, what do you think? I mean, how would that affect the average citizen here, as far as if people are exchanging in gold for goods and services at a retail level? Do we have any idea what that would do to us here?
Well, it certainly has everything to do with it. I mean, the reason, Sean, that your friend's laughing at you, or I'm sure anyone listening has friends and could name people who have done the same thing or would do the same thing if you felt like telling them about your investments. Yes, number one, stocks have been on a multi-decade rally, but number two, the Federal Reserve and the government of this country, it's been, a 30-plus year consolidated effort to denigrate gold and anything related to it. So that certainly has everything to do with it, that the general population doesn't know what it is,
right?
Doesn't invest in it, doesn't have anything to do with it.
Right. Brainwashed, essentially, away from knowing about the value of gold and silver and its history as money, real money.
Exactly.
Brainwashed, right.
But as far as it being part of an everyday system, whereas I go down to the grocery store and I've got, 2 or 3 gold coins or, a handful of silver coins, and that's what I'm buying my groceries with or paying the doctor with or filling up my vehicle with. I mean, if that's going to be happening in Asia, or is it going to be gold-backed notes, trading notes, as I've heard some other people say? I mean, what's that going to look like?
Yeah, it'll be the latter, and that's actually what Chinese officials are actually talking about, and academia and policy think tanks and whatnot. If you go over and look at all the materials that those kind of organizations publish, they speak of the gold-backed yuan and renminbi internationally as a possibility. And from a practical point of view, as long as people have faith that there's convertibility, there really isn't too much of a challenge, and we've had it in our history in the United States. So as long as there's, and this is a big if, as long as there's no massive restrictions of the trade of bullion into whatever is the next currency of the world, in the United States, then you would conceivably just be, cashiering your coins into something that's the representative fee out of the day in the United States after some kind of tumultuous currency reset of some sort. And that's probably where we're going. I mean, the financial system is unstable. The interest rates cannot be raised without causing a complete catastrophe. So we have no way of normalizing the system, and it's just a question of time. I mean, we're always debating, well, when's it going to be? But very few of us would debate that it's going to happen. And unfortunately, the writing's on the wall. This is just mathematics. We can't escape it. There is an illusion that we have a very high-functioning economy, and everyone looks at the jobless numbers in particular and sings Kumbaya on CNBC and so forth. But the reality is that there's so many problems when it comes to the overextension of debt in the global system and in first world countries in particular that it's just a question of when, not if, we have to have a day of reckoning. Because there are other ways of dealing with this, but the problems are so deep that having some kind of financial repression regime for 2 decades to try to fix over-indebtedness like we did after World War II is not an option this time around. The debt's too big.
Yeah, I think that you're right. And what we always like to say when we interview Andy Hoffman is we're documenting the collapse. People say, when is it going to happen? It's happening. I mean, it's happening. It's quantifiable. I mean, explain to me why all these nation states are eagerly joining up with the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. Why are all these nations gleefully joining together? Why do we see the formation of the BRICS? Why do we see Russia and China de-dollarizing? Why do we see India and nation states like Russia and China hoarding as much gold as they can get their hands on? Really, the only nation playing ball anymore with this country is Japan, and that's because they're in, since World War II, the end of World War II, they are a beholden nation state to the banking structure and the banksters. I'll tell you what, you guys, the other thing that's really disgusting that I wanted to hit on before we lose you, too, is the Yemen airstrikes. There was a report just the other day that the U.S. is gleefully joining in with Saudi Arabia in the airstrikes in Yemen. It just seems to me now that the military-industrial complex can do whatever the hell it wants, and then they report on it in the Mockingbird media, and Americans with their thumbs up their butts just go, okay, I guess we're going to be in another unconstitutional war without end, and everybody seems just fine with that. What do you make of what you see going on in the Middle East right now, Eric?
I don't think we've had a declared war since World War II.
Yeah.
What's going on in the Middle East is basically scrambling for resources and a competition for how the states are going to be divided after the ongoing conflict. And the old British model of colonialism is one of divide and conquer, because England, as a small island nation, certainly wouldn't have the capacity to control something directly as big as India, never mind the entire British Empire. That model is generalized in what the Anglo-American elites use now to deal with in areas like the Middle East, where we have basically client states like Saudi Arabia, and we use factions and tribes to do our fighting for us. And the situation in Yemen is particularly kind of fluid and kind of confusing, because in this whole last decade we've had rotations where, okay, we'll help set up Al-Qaeda forces that will do our bidding to go against Assad, for example, in Syria, and ISIS moderates that we would train and then hope to be very effective in trying to overthrow Syria, but then ultimately they become hardlined and they grow and establish themselves as the Islamic Caliphate, and the American media basically introduced them last year, like last summer.
John McCain's buddies.
Well, John McCain was definitely talking to a lot of these folks, organizing them and getting them funds and setting. I don't know if McCain did it directly when it comes to like the training that they received in Jordan and whatnot, but McCain has been a conduit that organized a lot of the Gulf state funds that came from Saudi Arabia and from United Arab Emirates and to some extent Kuwait, that literally were funding these factions of what ultimately became ISIS. And this goes back quite a long ways. I mean, the establishment of Al-Qaeda was originally done under the auspices of Osama bin Laden going over to Afghanistan, and the Saudi royal family wanting to prove their bona fides as very religiously upright people when they're Wahhabi Islam sect, the clerics in Saudi Arabia, although they're not formally part of the government, if you don't have the endorsement of the clerics in terms of your religious purity, according to this extreme version of Sunni Islam of the Wahhabi sect, then you're toast. I mean, they basically have the ability to delegitimize any of the royal family princes on a one-off basis, if not create a great turmoil. It's just this weird partnership that they have. It's like a religious cult that is in partnership with the ruling royal family government, and they basically give each other legitimacy. But anyway, they would love to, the Saudi royal family love to send these monies off to the good, pure Osama bin Laden, because it would prove to the clerics that they are in fact religiously pure and that they deserve to rule Saudi Arabia. And so you have kind of weird dynamic where all of this money has been flowing to all these terrorist organizations, and then, lo and behold, the terrorist organizations begin to grow their own internal ideological understanding of the world and what they'd like to see, and they want to have an Islamic caliphate, and guess what? That includes overthrowing Saudi Arabia. So, it's bizarre what's happening. We have all these weird alliances and things that are fluid, and in Yemen, the Houthi so-called rebels are more of the Shia sect of Islam, and they have loose relations with Iran. So Iran is helping them in the fight against the Saudi attack, and Saudi's client Hadi, the president that just took off last week to vacate the country as the rebels were taking over the rest of the land that they didn't control. And in the meantime, the United States is now finding itself in kind of a quasi-alliance with Iran when it comes to Iran, pushing out Islamic State fighters in Iraq. Iran basically liberated Tikrit, I believe is the third largest city in Iraq, from this Islamic State fighters. And here we are fighting alliances that make sense in one geography, but fighting the same overall backed group in a different geography. I mean, it's asinine.
What a mess.
And ultimately, the policy seems to be create as much chaos as possible, such that the countries are no longer functioning units, and in the long run, we will probably see new lines on the map drawn. For example, Kurdistan has long been envisioned as being established with a portion of Iraq's territory, a portion of Syria, and maybe even a sliver of Turkey pulled off. Yeah. So, this kind of stuff is what we're going to see evolve in the next 2 years.
Yeah, and I think it reflects the PNAC document, the Project for a New American Century, in their Middle Eastern wars, and maybe it reflects exactly what Zbigniew Brzezinski wanted out of his grand chessboard. This chaos that we're seeing, that I just described here a second ago as a mess, what a mess, is maybe exactly what they want, to your point, and then they can redraw all the maps out of the destruction. The phoenix will rise from the ashes, and they'll get their new world order, but I have to believe the plan is not going as well as they would like, given the level of chaos and the level of nation states turning against the dollar in really disgust at this point, because the government has abused its privilege of having a world's reserve currency to the extent now that all these other nation states are financing these endless wars without end, these endless wars. It's just terribly disgusting.
What is Russia and China? What's their role going to be? Because there's an alliance, not with any of these rogues that are going on, but I would think that both of those countries have a vested interest in what's going on, and we already know that Russia's been very vocal about Iran in particular.
And Syria. Russia's vowed to stand with Syria.
And, I mean, it seems like that at some point they're going to step up and say, well, now hold on. Will either Russia or China or both step in at some point, or will they just stay completely out of it?
It depends on what country you're talking about. If you're talking about Yemen, they're not going to really be doing much of anything unless it spills over to a conflagration that involves fighting in Saudi Arabia itself. Yemen being on the southernmost portion of the Saudi Arabian Peninsula, it doesn't really choke point any major flows that go in terms of tankers to China, for example. It does impact shipping traffic that goes through the Suez Canal. But other than that, strategically, it's not the same thing as if China were suddenly not receiving its oil shipments from Saudi Arabia and they didn't have enough energy. So the strategic importance to China is more of just ongoing business and the trade relations being normalized to the point where they can function. And as you can see, looking at the last 10 years, even with ongoing low-grade wars, you're still going to have trade going on. So that's probably a beehive that China wouldn't want to stick its finger into because it ends up complicating its relationship with the United States. And, all of these nations have kind of this juggling act that they perform to balance their various interests to the point of maximizing the assurance that the most of their interests can be met. So it's kind of a juggling act, and that's how China would look at a situation like Yemen. But if you go to a country like Iran, which is on the underbelly of the Asian continent and has very strong relationships with both Russia and China, and in particular with energy resources that they are already selling to China and hope to sell to Europe and beyond through this whole Silk Road network and piping network and infrastructure that China and Russia are leading players in developing. This represents a cornerstone of non-negotiable interest to both China and Russia, and that's why they would put their foot down and say, hey, if you're planning on trying to invade Iran, for example, kind of a crazy hypothetical because I don't think the United States would want to do that. And such a scenario for something like that is not even relevant right now because of the nature of our relationship. But, this whole negotiation of the Iranian non-proliferation status is something that, Russia and China are very interested in protecting Iran's interests because they see the overall relationship that they have with Iran being strategic enough that they'll fight to preserve it.
Which they should.
It's in their interest,
Yes.
They from a geopolitical point of view, the moralistic qualifiers of should and shall and all that kind of stuff is almost non-material when people put on the hat of geopolitics and procuring of a nation-state's interest. That's go for it. So Syria is a little different. There's a lot more in contention there. Russia has always had, or at least for many decades, has had a long-term relationship with Syria. They're the primary partner in the Mediterranean, and I don't think that's going to change anytime soon. But then again, if you look at the way things are right now, the United States is conducting covert operations in Syria. You have Israelis doing some of the same. You have the ISIS backed, Western-backed ISIS forces trying to basically overthrow Syria, and they're failing. But all of this going on in Russia at the same time is not doing anything pretty much other than saying that we object to what is going on, and they're not interacting at all. So there are shades of gray in terms of the degree to which China and Russia are willing to put their foot down. And at this point, it doesn't look like Putin and Russia is willing to prevent any escalation in Syria beyond what's going on right now. But it's not escalating, not so much because Russia is a backstop, but just simply because the Syrian army is effective.
Well, I think that what's happening, part of it is what you were saying as far as the new Silk Road going through and all the infrastructure that's going to be happening, and all of that's going to be going through that AIIB, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, and they are both. It seems like that Russia and China both are going about the business of conducting business, while the United States is going about the business of conducting war.
Yeah, it's 100%.
And that's our only business model outside of fraud is war. We have fraud and war, and the other countries, the big superpower countries for China and Russia, are just conducting business.
And some people might, think of that as, you're being hyperbolic. I mean, it's an exaggeration to go and say that that's our business model in the United States. But the reality is that as the dominant power for, ever since, without any exception or any controversy at all, since World War II, the United States has basically been dominating the main lay of the land when it comes to international commerce and the economic world order. And now that there is competition in the rise of China and even in the rise of even a country like Russia, the pie is being sliced up. And in reaction to that, we have this ever-increasing belligerent foreign policy that exercises our power to the hope of increasing our ability to hold on to this economic system. I mean, it's the thrashings of the declining economic order that the United States sees itself following when it comes to our military policies around the world.
Yeah,
I couldn't. Kind of unfortunate. I mean, the Chinese are more. I'm hesitant to use this word, but I think it is appropriate. They're more enlightened when it comes to how to build international relations. Around the world, they're using economic power as opposed to military.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with you guys. And Rory, you hit the nail on the head. If you contrast the AIIB, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, against the World Bank and the IMF, you will see one that is actually interested in loaning money to build infrastructure, and the other, the IMF, which is interested in loaning money that can't be repaid to steal infrastructure. And I think that may be the absolute paradigm shift that is the AIIB, is it's the Asians actually wanting to engage in trade in building nations up, and the IMF and the World Bank actively trying to tear things down.
Yeah, that fits in exactly what I was talking about before. I mean, basically, the institutions of the Bretton Woods system, the World Bank, the IMF, et cetera, were created to preserve the nature of the order as it existed after World War II. Mm-hmm. Whereas China is a rising power and it's trying to build out Asia, and there's this huge need for infrastructure. So rather than preserving a status quo, they're actually looking to form partnerships to build a new model. And qualitatively, that's a huge difference, and part of the reason why you see such eager interest amongst other countries like the United Kingdom and Italy and France and Germany and so forth to hitch their wagon to the AIIB and do business, because it's them and in their best interest as well. You said one point about the IMF and the World Bank. World Bank actually initially was the organization coming out of Bretton Woods that they thought they would do, loans for countries that found themselves with current account deficit problems and inability to pay loans and whatnot. Instead, the IMF has actually taken on that, and then they do their structural adjustment programs and demands for austerity and all of that stuff that it hurts countries. Greece is the best example right now.
Right.
Where they're probably going to go, most likely in a month's time, just exit.
Right.
Enslave them with debt.
Yeah, I mean, as it stands now, they're talking with the Russians and trying to get a parachute formulated so that they can deal with Germany and all the other European powers to be that are now, interestingly enough, seeming like they're going to want to, or at least be open to the possibility of Brexit more so than, say, 2 months ago.
Fascinating conversation. Because again, what did we see just a week or two ago, guys? We saw the United States military flex its love bomb muscles with the ICBM test. You know?
The Minuteman III test.
Yeah, correct. In which the military specifically said we wanted to show the world our ability to strike anywhere on the planet. And that sounds like an offensive weapon to me, not a defensive one. And it's just... It's sad to see our government and, this republic crumble in a way where the last measure of our strength are these nuclear weapons. It's very sad.
Yeah, we have switched over to a war-fighting first strike capability, and it's making its way to becoming a formal doctrine in the U.S. Military policy.
Yeah, and it should be very... Yeah, it should be very alarming, very scary, and it should be a wake-up call for any thinking person. And the other wake-up call is this dollar situation. The world's de-dollarizing. Some of the biggest nation states and economies on the planet are actively de-dollarizing. And even though my good friend wants to, giggle at the prospect of owning physical silver, I think most of our listeners are smarter than that. And I just want to thank Eric Dubin from News Doctors and, of course, the Doc from Silver Doctors for jumping on the line. Thanks, you guys.
Thank you.
Pleasure. Always great to be back with you guys.
Always terrific to have you. I want to point people to the banner at the top of SGT Report. We certainly do appreciate the support we've seen from SD Bullion. Doc, can you tell people about SD Bullion?
Sure. Shipping offer, $777 domestic flat rate shipping for all orders to the domestic United States. That's good with the Silver Eagle special, and any quantity 2 1/4 over spot, whether you're buying an ounce or a couple thousand. The empty monster boxes are starting to stack up high in the back offices, so if you want to stop by, you can grab a couple, Sean.
All right, guys, let's take it to the U.S. Mint. Let's see if we can't beat last year's record. Eric, can you tell people about the News Doctors?
TheNewsDoctors.com is a general website that has a lot of different feeds from places that people know and love, such as Zero Hedge and Contra Corner from David Stockton and lots of other feeds. And then we marry that with stories that I hand select, and anything that you see in the geopolitics section of the site is stuff that I've personally put into the site. Anything in the top 4 or so stories that you see above the fold or things that I'll put in there that I think are very important stuff that people need to find out about. And we focus on international finance and politics, geopolitics, and local U.S. politics.
And, of course, there's the ever-popular precious metals site, silverdoctors.com. And, Rory, let's call out the Daily Coin. Tell people about your site.
Well, thank you. I cover quite a bit of the geopolitics and economics as well, and do quite a bit of original work as well. You'll find all the original work on the left-hand side under Original Works.
All right, and Rory does a lot of heavy lifting at SGT Report. Well, I want to thank you guys all for jumping on. Sure do appreciate it, and I want to thank all of you who are listening. I want to thank you for liking and sharing this information with those that you care about. It's an opportunity to wake up friends, family members, and colleagues. They may laugh at the precious metals story, but ultimately those of us who hold precious metals will have the last laugh. And I hope you all have a terrific weekend and week ahead. Thanks for supporting us at sgtreport.com. Bye-bye.